welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, an international tribunal has ruled in favor of the Philippines in its ongoing territorial dispute with China, a ruling China rejects. What's next? And EU officials have arrived in Beijing to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Will the economic fallout from Brexit impact China's relationships in the region? We start today's show with the South China Sea arbitration. Since former Filipino President Benigno Aquino III unilaterally initiated the arbitration against China in January of the year 2013, tensions have been brewing in the region. On Tuesday, an arbitration tribunal in The Hague released a ruling that's not in favor of China. But China holds the same stance it did 3 years ago. It does not recognize the illegal proceedings. President Xi Jinping of China reaffirmed that Nanhai Zhudao, or the South China Sea Islands, have been Chinese territory since ancient times.
3.5 years in the making. Now, a nearly 500-page ruling. The Hague said there is no legal basis to China's historic rights to resources within the waters it claims. China's stance remains the same. The award is null and void and has no binding force. China neither accepts nor recognizes it.
Chinese people will not accept the result, and all people around the world who uphold justice will not accept the result. China's non-acceptance and non-participation is to safeguard international rule of law and regional rules. Now the farce is over. It's time to get back to the right track. China has taken note of the signals from the Philippine government that is willing to resume discussion with China over the South China Sea issue.
Let's talk. Earlier this month, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte offered to sit down with China. The Chinese Foreign Ministry considered the case to be of bad faith and violating international law, aiming not to resolve the relevant disputes between the two countries, but to deny China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights in the South China Sea. China's officials have repeatedly reminded the tribunal that the South China Sea issue is not subject to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Article 298 of the UNCLOS excludes compulsory arbitration on issues including maritime boundaries. In 2006, China declared it would exercise its rights under Article 298. Around 70 countries have expressed support for China, and the fallout of the verdict is expected to have a regional impact.
And for more discussion on the result of the South China Sea arbitration, we are joined in our studio by Professor Zhu Feng, Executive Director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea from Nanking University. And also in Bonn, we are joined by Professor Stephen Tolman, who is the Director of the Institute of Public International Law at the University of Bonn. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. First of all, I would like to get immediate comment from both of you about the award coming from the arbitration. Professor Tolman, your view here.
I think the award is really amazing. I haven't had, of course, a chance to read the more than 500 pages of this award, but I think it will be a groundbreaking award that will go down in international legal history, both for its substance and for its procedure, but it will go down probably for all the wrong reasons. It will be not a beacon for the international rule of law, but it will be a sign of a tribunal having misjudged the situation it was called to rule upon.
Very strong opinion coming, Professor Tolman. What do you think, Professor Zhu?
I think the awarding is really jokingly surprising me, because I couldn't imagine how partial and unfair it is, because it's not just to make up some sort of reality, but also misjudging some sort of a very conceivable evidence. For example, the ruling also, just as I mentioned, some sort of aggravation of the friction in the South China Sea. It's some sort of sign of, we say, politicization by a number of the judges or arbiters. So that's very ridiculous.
Okay, we have already, both of you talked. Some viewers might ask us, why don't you have some Filipino scholars as well in this discussion? By the way, we have been working very hard over the past one day to contact all the Filipino guests who ever appeared on our show. Apparently, they are all having other commitments. Having said that, though, let me come back to you, Professor Tolman, to have some specifics. What do you make of what some believe as this award sweepingly sided with the Filipino side? Do you agree with that kind of judgment?
Yes, I think it is. It is really startling and amazing that this is a war that is going totally into one side's direction. I've hardly ever seen such a ruling. You could say this is a ruling almost 98% going in the Philippines' direction. There is no balance, and I also think this one-sided ruling does not really meet the complexity of the case. There is hardly a case where there is a clear black and white situation, but the ruling really gives the impression that there is a black and white world out there in the South China Sea, and it seems to be that China is being allocated the black part, and the Philippines is allocated the white part in this scenario.
Professor Tolman, some would say, well, the Chinese did not participate in the proceedings at all, and therefore they probably will be the black part, quote unquote.
That is probably true. I think this is one of the questions one would have to ask if the tribunal would have decided in any other way if China had actively participated in the case. But of course, the tribunal has taken note of some of China's positions and still has reached, in my view, the wrong conclusions. It has still misinterpreted in a way China's position, for example, on the question of the territorial sovereignty over the island groups in the South China Sea. I think not much could have been gained with China being present in the courtroom. It would still have made the same declaration as it made in its foreign ministry's statement.
Professor Zhu, your view here, sweepingly sided with the Filipino side, or not really?
Of course, it's a reality. So then that's also a very appalling reality we could easily figure out from this award. We say, what's the international arbitration? First of all, it should just keep some delicate balance between the different sides. Second, it also should be very solid reflection of some sort of, we say, such a contending arguments, rather than just unbelievably and overwhelmingly leaning towards one side. To be honest, I don't care how favorable or unfavorable from this awarding, but we need justice. We need fairness. But I couldn't find any such words, any such meaning from this award. So I have to say it's completely a consequence of a politicization.
Okay. Professor Tolman, let's just be very professional. I know you have been over the past few minutes. Let's continue to be that way. What does this mean, this precedence from this arbitration, the award? How much impact and implication would they have for other territorial disputes between countries, among countries? Particularly with the fact this time reefs have become the most significant issue in judging about territorial disputes. If that is the case, what would that mean for all the other countries who have territories on the sea? Many would ask this very significant question. Professor Tolman.
I think this is a groundbreaking judgment, not just for China and the Philippines, but for the whole international community. It will have reverberations well beyond this very dispute, and it will affect the territorial claims of many other states. We could say maritime boundaries will have to be redrawn after this decision, because many of the islands on the basis of which states have made claims to maritime entitlements will no longer be accepted as islands that generate these maritime entitlements. So this will have effects for many states, including the United States, Canada, but also Japan and other states in Southeast Asia.
And what would that mean? Will others take advantage of this award and file similar territorial disputes requests like the Philippines to whatever the special arbitration? And what kind of situation would that be, Professor Tolman, eventually?
I think what we have at the moment is the pronouncement of the arbitral tribunal. We will have to see how the international community reacts to this decision. We have seen many decisions by international tribunals before where states, the international community, have not accepted a particular ruling and have acted contrary to that ruling. So I would suspect that many states will not accept the tribunal's ruling on the status of islands and low tide elevations. I cannot see the United States or Canada, or for that reason Japan, change its legal views, which it has held for many years, and give up territorial claims in various sea areas. So what I would say is we will have to wait and see how states react to this ruling and whether they will abide by this ruling. Because, of course, many of the pronouncements made by the tribunal are of a general nature that will also affect other states.
Right. The UNCLOS itself, as we mentioned many times, have the issue of whether it should have jurisdiction over the sovereignty when it comes to these kind of special arbitrations. Having said that, though, talking about attitudes coming from relevant parties, after the ruling was issued, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, on behalf of the Chinese government, responded immediately with a statement. Let's take a look at this, declaring that China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests in the South China Sea shall under no circumstances be affected by those awards. China opposes and will never accept any claim or action based on those awards. End of quote. That is the statement coming from the Chinese Foreign Ministry representing the Chinese government right after the award came out. Professor Zhu, having said that though, what would this mean? That China's, first of all, no participation and no acceptance and no recognition of both the proceeding, now the award of this special arbitration?
Of course, I think China's position has been very consistent and very clear-cut. But the problem is, before the releasing of the awards, then probably there will be some sort of a suspicion about how desirable such a complete opposition will be. But after the releasing of the award, I think all the suspicion disappeared, because faced with such a very, very, we say, misstructured and misplaced, international jurisdiction, I think that China not just lose the last theme of some sort of respect to the tribunal, but also I think it's become some sort of a very big, the fear of the future's, territorial disputes in South China Sea. Because if no one could have found any justifiable treaty, then why we should put the trust on this tribunal system?
I see. Very interesting. Having said that, though, Professor Tolman, let me come back to you. What do you make of it? One party of those territorial disputes between this time, apparently China and the Philippines, is not even accepting the award. Does that make the award relevant? And in the future, does that make any award coming from these kind of special arbitration relevant?
I think, of course, tribunals have to be judged by their rulings. And at the end of the day, especially a tribunal that has no means of enforcing its awards, will have to convince states by the quality of its judgment. Now, if a judgment cannot convince the international community, it will be without effect, especially, as I said, there is no enforcement mechanism. It will depend on the quality of the reasoning, and it will also depend on to what extent the award can contribute to the settlement of a dispute that is before the tribunal.
Lastly, before we go, Professor, how are we going to make sure that our international legal system and international legal mechanism will be immune as much as possible? We can't say 100%, but as much as possible from now in the future to political and geopolitical manipulations. What does it take?
I think it will be very, very difficult to prevent such situations from reoccurring. There have always been states that have used and abused the legal system to further their own political aims. And I don't think that we can do much about this. What we can do is, especially as academics, if we see a wrong or a bad reasoned judgment, we can point that out to the international community and can show the flaws in such rulings so that the ruling itself will be of little effect in the international legal sphere.
Professor Zhu, briefly?
Of course, presumably we should just trust the arbiter or such a judge of the tribunal will maintain the integrity, but actually I have to say the ruling is a bigger disaster and they really disgraced for their professionalism.
With that, we are coming to the end of the first part of our discussion. We have to bid goodbye to Professor Stephen Tallman, who are talking to us about the legal expert's perspective. Thank you so much, Professor Tallman from the University of Bonn. And Professor Zhu, you want to stay with us for the latter part of the discussion. There is a third party, as they say, in this China-Philippine dispute that we cannot ignore. Many have been pointing their fingers to the United States, one of the most vocal countries urging China to hew to arbitration. Is still an outlier to the UNCLOS, to which more than 160 countries are part. Let's take a look.
With the excuse of freedom of navigation and overflight, the U.S. military and some certain countries have conducted close-in maneuvers in the waters and airspace of China's Nansha Islands and reefs. A U.S. military vessel once entered the waters around China's Xisha Islands, which are part of China's inherent territory. The U.S. has officially embraced a pivot to Asia strategy since 2009, and Philippine policymakers have suggested that the country is under pressure from Washington to find issues with China. But China, which has long been pushing a new model of major power relationship, suggests that Asia and the Pacific region are big enough for all.
And now we have both Professor Zhu Feng from Nanking University with us in the Beijing studio, and also Ding Zheng joining us from Washington, D.C. in the U.S. Mr. Cheng is a senior research fellow at the Asia Studies Center of the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at Heritage Foundation. Welcome to our program, Mr. Cheng. First of all, I would like to begin by asking both of you, gentlemen, one simple question. How should all sides react to the award? We have communicated with our audience earlier. We tried to contact all the Filipino experts. We have already tried before, but none of them could be available for this. So I would like to ask you, Professor Zhu, for this. We heard from the Filipino foreign minister who said that the Philippines would use two words, call for sovereignty and also restraint regarding the award. What is your understanding coming from the Filipino side?
Of course, I think I really appreciate the dictator governments and for some sort of a self-restraint. It's very, very important. For this critical moment, I also hope all the parties, including China, we could also be just not overreacting, and a self-restraint is absolutely important because no one can benefit from the escalating of the tension in South China Sea.
I see. What about you, Mr. Cheng? We understand the U.S. Aircraft carrier is still patrolling in the South China Sea. Is it still going to be their mission? The mission is still going to continue? What would that mean for all parties?
Well, the mission of the U.S. Navy has always been preserving freedom of the seas. And I don't see this particular arbitration decision as affecting that. But it's useful to note here that we are also in the middle of the RIMPAC exercises, to which China was invited and is attending. And in fact, China has 5 ships currently participating in the RIMPAC exercises. So I don't think that this is quite as black and white as some would like to portray it.
On the other hand, Professor Zhu, we heard from the Chinese President Xi Jinping after the award came out. China did not recognize, would not participate, now would not accept the award. But he also said this: China has been a guardian of international rule of law and fairness and justice. We'll always adhere to the path of peaceful development. What do you think? Will China react? Because the earlier drill already come to an end on Monday, one day before the ruling comes out. So what do you think should be the reaction coming from the Chinese side?
Of course, now China become some sort of, we say, a very diversified country. There's a lot of views and counter views. So for the moment, I really hope President Xi's remarks is not just some sort of a reminder for Chinese people, but also to international community. On the one hand, I think his remark is very strongly showcasing some sort of China's unshakable resolve to safeguard the sovereignty. But on the other hand, he also emphasizing that China should abide by the international law. But the problem is the Tribunal Award is really out of your imagination. It's some sort of very remarkable and a notorious partiality. Is really out of any scope the Chinese could feel soft about that.
Mr. Cheng, having said that, what would that mean? Can you hear us clearly, Mr. Cheng?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you. What would that mean? The whole award itself, and now you see the diplomacy seem to be brewing, yet no one knows which direction it would take. So what do you think could be the constructive role the U.S. could play?
Well, the U.S. has long stood, as you've already noted, for calling for arbitration. The arbitration decision has come down. The Filipino government has said that it is interested in holding discussions, and in this regard, it would be very useful for the Manila government to clarify exactly where it's coming down on the issue of what exactly it wants to pursue. But I think the important thing here is for this to reopen discussions. I think part of the issue here, and this is, I think, part of what has come out of the arbitration, is that when you are not present, arbitration continues to go forward. What has happened is that China has unfortunately, in a sense, forfeited or abdicated its role in the arbitration proceedings.
But the question is now, the arbitration already come out with an award. The question is how parties would react. I think now this is the most important question. So may I follow up by asking you, of course you're coming from an expert's perspective, should Washington and will Washington exert pressure to Manila for getting down to more issues with China in terms of territorial disputes once the award comes out?
I think, as the U.S. has expressed in the past, the U.S. is more than happy to offer its good offices to promote discussion among all of the claimants. This is not just a Filipino decision. This is a decision that affects all of the people, all of the nations that are making claims over the South China Sea. This affects Vietnam's claims, this affects Malaysia's claims, as well as obviously China's claims, and even the Taiwan holdings on Ituaba.
All right, Professor Zhu, your response.
Okay, yes, I think Mr. Chen made the point, the U.S. backing the talks, but with the different or contending priority. For example, from China, would like to have a bilateral one. The U.S. just pushing on a multilateral one. But we consider, for example, such a lingering territorial dispute probably should be better running through some sort of, we say, such a bilateral one. But on the other hand, we also see America's stance, of course, is very challenging Chinese. So then the question is very important. U.S. is supporting the talk, but the problems on what base, in what way?
Interesting. And will this, the award itself and the territorial disputes between China and the Philippines being flared up by some relevant parties, will this speed up the arms race or escalation of tensions and military buildup in the region? I think that is the ultimate question. That's the ultimate question that's likely to influence the peace and stability of the region. Mr. Chung, your assessment here.
Well, I think that when we look at the military forces that are deployed and the military forces that are available, it is difficult to imagine how the Philippines, whose most modern warship is a 40-year-old ex-American Coast Guard cutter, is really in a position to challenge the People's Liberation Army Navy, which is one of the largest navies in the world and now has a new aircraft carrier and frankly has some of the most modern warships anywhere in the world. I think that it's important to sort of recognize the bilateral relations. I understand why Professor Zhu calls for this, why the Chinese Foreign Ministry calls for this. But the reality is that you have a remarkable mismatch between the kinds of capabilities that the Chinese military fields and that of any military in the region, certainly among the claimant states of the South China Sea.
All right, Professor Zhu, should everybody have the same kinds of militaries, the same numbers of missiles, the same kinds of aircraft carriers by all countries that are having territorial disputes in the region? Your answer here.
Yeah, I think such a asymmetrical strength is not China's some sort of, we say, mistake. So such a asymmetric, the mismatch probably is also some sort of, we say, intentions and also very, very negative. But the problem is, I also hope the U.S. or China, for such a very critical moment, where most important the two players, we should cool down.
All right. I hope that will be the case. This will be the time for people to think at least for how diplomacy should work from day one. In fact, it should be. Thank you so much for all of your input, Professor Zhu Feng and also Mr. Ding Chen. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. Weeks after Brexit, EU officials have arrived in Beijing to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. So how will China navigate its relationships with the EU and Britain? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. The annual China-EU summit has opened on Tuesday in Beijing. Since it began in the year 1998, the summit has been an important platform for deepening economic and political relations. Amid the current uncertainty of Brexit fallout and frictions over the steel industries of the two sides, the summit is set to boost the future cooperation and exchanges.
Fostering deeper relations. China and the European Union kicked off a summit Tuesday, aiming to deepen the two sides' economic and political relations. President Xi Jinping met with European Council President Donald Tusk and European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker on the sidelines of the summit. Officials say China will make an initial investment of about 2 billion euros in the European Union's new infrastructure fund at the summit. Also high on the agenda will be a proposed investment treaty between the two sides.
We hope that China can achieve a mutually beneficial investment agreement with the EU as soon as possible. Particularly given the sluggish world economy, we believe that if China and the EU, as two major world economies, can reach such an agreement, it will benefit not only the two sides, but also the prosperity, recovery and growth of the world economy.
China and the EU boast close economic relations. The EU is China's biggest trading partner, while China is the EU's second largest trading partner and one of the biggest markets for the bloc. However, China-EU relations also face frictions and uncertainties. Steel has become a source of tension between the two sides, as Chinese producers are accused of shipping their surplus to Europe at a cheap price. And China is deeply concerned about the EU's reluctance to recognize it as a market economy. The recent Brexit adds further uncertainty to the relationship. The annual summit will be the first high-level meeting between China and the EU since Britain voted to leave the bloc. Beijing has fostered close ties with Britain in recent years. The UK is the first Western country to seek to become a founding member of the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And China brought in heavy investment to the UK when President Xi visited the nation in late 2015. But with or without the UK, the European Union remains a highly important partner to China. The China-EU leaders meeting in the aftermath of Brexit will be a good opportunity for the two sides to take stock of recent developments.
And for more on the China-EU summit, we are joined in the Beijing studio, Mr. Cui Hongjian, a senior research fellow and director of the Department of European Studies from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir, to our program. Meanwhile, we're also joined from Brussels, Mr. Fraser Cameron, the director of the EU Asia Center, who is also a former British diplomat and EU official. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Cameron, we understand the UK welcomed its second female prime minister, Theresa May, even though the handover of power will take a few days between Mr. Cameron and Ms. May. It seems that politics stabilized a bit in London. What do you make of this new development?
Well, it's quite extraordinary. It's almost like a Shakespearean drama, the way that the main advocates of the Leave campaign have all sort of dropped dead on the floor with daggers dripping blood. Johnson's gone, Gove's gone, Leedson's gone, Nigel Farage is gone, and Theresa May stands there as the winner. She was actually a quiet supporter of Remain campaign, and now she has got the difficult job, firstly, of uniting the party, and secondly, of negotiating a sensible withdrawal of Britain from the EU over the next couple of years. So it's a pretty big task, but most people think she is a very experienced and capable politician and will do a reasonably good job.
What would that mean for Europe from your perspective, Mr. Cui? After all, the UK is still one of the biggest economies on the European continent, whether there's a Brexit or not.
Yes, exactly. So I think that's the reason why I think, especially from China's perspective, we should keep a very close observation. How is the relations in future between UK and the EU? Because yes, now the UK is still the fifth biggest economy in the world, but maybe not tomorrow, because it depends on how could this kind of arrangement between UK and the EU, especially because from the Leave campaign during the referendum, they give a very good picture to average people in UK, so that once we leave from EU, we will have a bigger platform, we have more and more opportunities to have a bigger and bigger economy. Yeah.
There are three things that is fluid right now, Mr. Cameron, it seems. One is how the UK would assemble itself together once again, be united, quote unquote, to work on its own problems and challenges. Secondly is how the EU would also clean its own backyards in order to get rid of some of the problems and move forward for the better. The thirdly, of course, is the interaction between the UK and the EU, and what would that mean for all the other countries who are looking at themselves and suggesting whether they should stay or remain under what circumstances. So, Mr. Cameron, given all of these three fluid fronts, what do you think could be the advice that you could have for China, who is, of course, looking at the European continent, pondering, what's next?
Well, nothing's going to change in the immediate future. Britain will be a member until 2019. And in that period, I think some of the issues will be clarified as regards the outlines of a new trade deal between Britain and the EU. Meanwhile, the EU will continue trade negotiations with China, with Japan, India, the United States, and will take into account these new circumstances. So there will be a certain amount of uncertainty, but basically the EU will remain in business, and as we know from today's summit, it will want to remain a good partner for China.
The EU wants to remain as it was to a certain extent, Mr. Cui, but that is coming from the EU leaders. Yeah. It is not necessarily coming from the statement of every capital. So there is a difference between that. And having said that, though, Mr. Cui, what do you think? After this Brexit, there has been a lot of soul searching, both inside the UK and in other countries of the EU, about what kind of politics they want. What kind of European Union they want. What kind of freedom, as they committed the 4 types of freedoms of the EU, they really want, and under what circumstances? So how would this eventually impact on the future direction of the EU as a whole?
Yes, I think that certainly now it's a very, very big question for European Union, for European integration, as we call it. But of course, the Brexit and also the referendum, it's just a very, British-style answer to this question. Of course, the answer is we have to leave. But of course, now that's also a reason why now within the European Union, there are more and more debates or discussions. How could the European Union do some reform to, to be face of this? All of these, different answers from member states, not only from UK, because if we, as we know that now there are some more and more, Eurosceptics in member states, not only from UK, from Central and Eastern European countries, but certainly there are, different concerns and different answers. But I think maybe some common, questions to European Union is how could the European Union to have some more efficiency to deal with some issue like a refugee issue or data crisis, and how could the European Union have some more representativeness, not only just have a parliament, how could it narrow down the gap between the, the elites in Brussels and those average people in member states.
Yes, that's very interesting. That is also an issue, the efficiency issue concerning, it seems, some of the issues between China and the EU. For example, about market economy status. Mr. Cameron, Beijing has been insisting on its rights to embrace a market economy status coming from the EU. We understand there has been different opinions over the years, member states, they do not necessarily agree with one another, and there's the efficiency issue as well, the proceedings. So what do you make these kind of international relations, international trade and economic ties issues? Will that be, in a way, getting better resolved with the soul searching of the EU after Brexit? Or am I doing some wishful thinking?
Yeah. No, I think the very latest polls in most member states have shown an increased support for the EU even after Brexit. I certainly don't think there will be any copycat referendum anywhere else. But there are certainly different visions of where Europe would go, and until we have the elections next year in France, Germany, Italy and the Netherlands, we will not be able to take any major steps forward. So in the meantime, I think we will have more of the same, of the EU continuing to negotiate. It's still the largest trade bloc in the world, and it will have to demonstrate to both its citizens and to partners, particularly China, that it is capable of doing deals, whether it's on the market economy status, whether it's on the bilateral investment treaty. But the EU will remain in business, absolutely.
What do you think, Mr. Cui? Market economy status, China's enormous amount of investment and potential investment on the European continent, how would these be better protected in a way so that the trade relations will still be on track?
Yes, exactly. I think that now this MES issue in Brussels, even now we find out perhaps agreement in Parliament, but indeed we can find out conflicts within the member states of the European Union, because we can find out perhaps UK, okay, a very a case to support China on this issue, or maybe some other European Union member states, which has a very good competitiveness compared with Chinese product and so on. But another question is, how could European Union to form a single attitude on this issue, and how could China and the European Union work together to deal with the issue of overcapacity? Because I don't think the overcapacity issue is a difficult issue between China and the EU, because it's a global phenomenon after this very bad situation for all the economy. So I think this time between China and the EU for the summit, both leaders could touch this issue and try to get some consensus that this issue is not an issue between us, it's an issue we need to work together to deal with it.
All right. Of course, overcapacity, one could easily be reminded of the steel production inside China and also inside the European countries. But the question is, Mr. Cui, with so much turbulent politics going on, whether at the capitals of the EU countries and also in Brussels, can politicians really work on real issues? Do they still have the extra energy? But of course, the real issues, once being worked on, would really contribute to the real answers. But the thing is, what is their priority? What is your sense here, Mr. Cui?
Yes, I think that's always a very, very big question, not only within European Union, between different institutions in Brussels, and also always a bigger question between China and the EU. Just like Mr. Farage from UK, this time after Brexit, he criticized some member of parliament in Brussels, said, you did not create any job opportunity for people. You just stay in your office, you just say, okay, just criticize somebody else, some country like China, like that. So I think now the question is, how could the European Union recognize the common challenge for China and the European Union?
I see. Of course, Mr. Farage's statements have been interpreted in so many different ways by so many different people who get to know his personalities over the decades. But having said that, though, Mr. Cameron, your thoughts, can the politicians really work on the real issues, particularly issues between China and the EU? After all, these are big trade partners for one another.
Of course. I mean, you shouldn't forget that actual problems in trade amount to less than 2% of total trade, and we have a similar, percentage in the problems we have with the United States. It's inevitable when you have a trade relationship as big as that between the EU and China, there will be problems from time to time. But remember, 80% of trade flows quite satisfactorily, and there are new agreements, new areas to work on, whether it's connectivity, digital areas, the environment, green growth, urbanization. There's actually a very positive agenda there between the EU and China, and this is what the leaders will be discussing today. So although the media headlines may focus on MES and to some extent South China Sea, there is a very practical, positive EU-China agenda.
That's why we're featuring this topic also on our show as well, Mr. Cameron. Thank you so much, Fraser Cameron and also Cui Hongjian. Thank you very much, the two gentlemen, for being with us. Appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.